for taking the time to join us today. It's 2 p.m. in Saudi Arabia. We will be discussing a topic today over the course of probably approximately 1 hour, which isn't a new topic. So you might ask yourself, why on earth are we organizing a webinar on this topic? Well, it is because we believe it still presents a very good opportunity for businesses overall to avail of. It's not that often that tax authorities organize a amnesty, a waiver of penalties, and I think it's still a very good opportunity that we want to place back into the minds of people so that they think of it while conducting business in Saudi Arabia, knowing that many of yourselves might be changing the way in which their operations work in Saudi Arabia, given the many legal and regulatory changes in the last couple of years. So we obviously only focus on the tax bits. I'll be joined today by my colleague Dana, who'll be taking you through some of the aspects as well of the amnesty. But let me first show you what we will be covering today. So over the course of approximately an hour, we will discuss what are the highlights of the amnesty, what are the violations covered. Not everything is covered. Not for everything you will receive a waiver. Probably very interesting to yourselves is what use cases that we've seen that this has been applied for. And then obviously how to avail it, how to proceed with availing the amnesty. Donna will be covering points 1 and 2. I'll be covering points 3 and 4 to then go back to Donna for other factors, and to subsequently end with an opportunity for yourselves perhaps to ask us any questions that you might have in relation to the topic. My name is Thomas. I'm the managing partner of Orifers, and Donna is a counsel in our team in Riyadh. Over to you, Donna, to discuss some of the highlights of the amnesty.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So I'll be taking you through the highlights of the current amnesty. As Thomas has mentioned before, it has started in July 2024. So the application period will be from July 2024 until 31st of December of this year. The coverage is broad. It will cover registered taxpayers and non-registered taxpayers, including non-residents. So if you are a non-resident performing business in KSA and you become aware that you need to be registered for VAT purposes or CIT purposes, this amnesty will cover the delay registration penalty. We have here also the taxes covered: value-added tax, withholding tax, income tax, excise tax, and the real estate transfer tax, which will be all covered under this amnesty. Taxes not covered is custom taxes and Zakat. In addition to that, we also have some exclusions that would not be eligible to benefit from this amnesty, which are any fines that have been paid before the start date of the amnesty, and the fines resulted from tax evasions. These will not be covered under the current extended amnesty. And here we will take you through the detailed violations covered. Yes. So we first have the delayed registration, including non-resident, as we mentioned. If you are a non-resident and you become aware that you need to be registered for VAT purposes or CIT, you become aware that you have a PE in KSA, then the delay registration, which is 10,000 Saudi Riyal, will be waived. In addition to that, late filings of returns any kind of returns, which is the corporate income tax returns, withholding tax returns, and VAT returns. Or if you become aware of any error in a previously submitted return and you need to correct it, the additional penalty on that or late payment on the additional tax will be waived. And of course, all these penalties will be waived on one condition, which is paying the principal tax due before the end of the amnesty, which is 31st of December 2024. Also, we have the field detection penalties for violation of VAT invoices and e-invoicing, which will be covered in the next part. What is not covered under this amnesty? So any payments or any delay fines resulted for returns within the period of the amnesty. Let's say you have a VAT return in July or a withholding return. Any delay fine resulted from this return will not be covered under this amnesty. So this amnesty covers periods before the start date, which is before July 1st, 2024. Here we have the field detections for the VAT invoices. So any non-compliance of issuance of the invoice or credit or debit note, non-compliance of the information reported on that invoice, and any incorrect calculation of the tax due of these invoices, failure to keep invoices and accounting records for VAT purposes. Also, any penalties resulted from these field detections will not be will be covered under this amnesty, and the company will be able to waive the penalties resulted from these field detections. Also, preventing ZATCA's employees from performing their duties. So, for example, if ZATCA is doing an audit on your firm and for any reason you're trying to hinder ZATCA from any information, any penalties resulted from that will be covered under this amnesty, and you will be able to waive this penalty. Any other violations of the VAT law and regulations. Yes, and here we have the detailed e-invoicing violations that are covered. Failure to inform ZATCA of e-invoicing malfunctions of your system. Inclusion of prohibited functions of e-invoicing systems. Removing or amendment of e-invoices after issuance. And failure to maintain or issue invoices or credit notes electronically as per the prescribed periods with the ZATCA, and non-inclusion of the QR code in the e-invoices. So any violation of these kinds for the e-invoices will be covered under the amnesty, and you will be able to request ZATCA and apply for the amnesty to waive such penalties. And we have, use cases. I will be handing over to Thomas to take you over the use cases.
Thank you very much, Donna. Apologies for flicking the slides back and forth before. I was trying to minimize myself on my own screen. I think especially the e-invoicing violations are quite important. We see that the threshold for phase 2 for e-invoicing has been lowered very substantially. So there's many more businesses that need to be complying with phase 2 of the e-invoicing, and therefore many more potential violations as well. So a good opportunity to look at those cases. Now, what we've done in the next bit is we've looked at a couple of use cases specifically on what could be the situations that present themselves where there's a violation, therefore a penalty, and which present a good opportunity for availing the benefits, right? Here, for example, use case number 1 is simply a company that filed its return late. As you may know, looking at a company subject to corporate income tax, which means that there's a non-Saudi shareholder in full. And let's assume for a second that that entity has a reporting year based on a calendar year, had revenue last year, but actually turned a loss in Saudi Arabia. Its return would have been due by the end of April 2024, but it only filed a couple of months later. You see in the table what would be the penalties which are applicable to that entity, which would be either 1% of the revenue or 20,000 riyals. So whatever is lower out of those two, with the 20,000 riyals being a max. In this specific case, we don't have an unpaid amount because there's no corporate tax liability due, so you wouldn't get an additional penalty. So really, it's the 20,000 riyals of penalty that you would be able to get waived as part of the amnesty if you go ahead and file your return late during the amnesty period. So that's a fairly easy one. It's essentially filing your return late that would be covered under the amnesty. Situation number two is one that we've often encountered for our clients, which is a situation where a foreign entity has a Saudi permanent establishment. So let's say, for example, that you have a company based in the UAE, regularly sends its employees to Saudi Arabia for business purposes. They provide technical support. They do site visits. Maybe they have an office there, which is available to them. The client comes to the realization that actually it should be registering a permanent establishment in Saudi Arabia with effect from the 1st of January 2022. This means that on the income which is attributable to Saudi Arabia, to the permanent establishment in Saudi Arabia, there's a 20% corporate income tax which is due on the profits in Saudi Arabia. As you may know, in addition to that, the amount after tax may incur an additional 5% withholding for a deemed distribution as well. For this specific entity in this example, its net revenue generated 600,000 riyals in 2022, 850,000 in 2023. The corporate income tax rate is 20%. So therefore, the tax liability is respectively 120,000 and 170,000. The client registers the permanent establishment and pays the taxes due during the amnesty in 2024. What you see in front of you is the calculation of what that results in. First off, we have a penalty for non-registration, 10,000 riyals, which Dana already mentioned. That's a one-time penalty. Once you're registered, that's it. Then we have a late payment tax or late payment fee. We don't call interest, it's late payment fees, where we apply a 1% per month initially, and then additional percentages for the balance days. So in this case, what we see is for the 2022 filing, in our assumed example, we have 14% for 428 days, which gives us a late payment fee of 16,800. And on the 2023 side, also a corresponding penalty. In addition to that, what we have is a penalty for non-filing of the returns, which would be either 1% of the revenue, and that 1% of the revenue goes up to 20,000 riyals, or depending on the case and depending on the delay, either 25% of unpaid tax or 10% of unpaid tax. The total potential savings on the left-hand side are 46,800. And on the right-hand side, so 46,800 barring the non-registration fee. And on the right-hand side, we see 22,100. So you come forward, make a profit attribution, and you settle the penalty, then those are the penalties that would be waived. Another example, and this is a pure VAT example, we have a foreign business that is supplying electronically supplied services to Saudi Arabia, only to non-taxable persons. In other words, it's not a B2B situation. If it would have been a B2B situation, the reverse charge mechanism would have been applicable. Company C wrongly thought that there was no VAT due. Perhaps it hadn't heard of a VAT regime in Saudi Arabia, given that it's only 6 years old, or it had mistakenly thought that the client would settle the VAT, but comes to the realization that actually it should have been registered for VAT purposes, and appoints a fiscal representative to file the missing VAT returns. So a couple of offenses. One is the lack of registration, for which there's a 10,000 dirham penalty. Late payment of the tax, for which there's a 5% penalty on that 1 million SAR. And then the non-filing or the late filing of the returns up to 25%, which produces another penalty of approximately 250,000 riyals. So in total, we've got 310,000 riyals. So you see that for VAT purposes, because the VAT is calculated on the turnover rather than on the profits, the consequences in terms of the penalties are much heavier than when it comes to corporate income tax. So this company, if it comes forward during the amnesty period, clears the returns which are covered by the amnesty period and pays the VAT before the end of the amnesty period, it can avail of the benefits of the amnesty period. Now, how do I do that really? And I've actually alluded to it already a couple of times. Essentially, it is to come forward and make sure that you become compliant. And becoming compliant may entail as simple as 3 steps. If you're not yet registered with ZATCA for VAT for corporate income tax purposes, the first step is obviously the registration. Over the process of the registration, you're going to have to indicate as from which point you believe that tax liabilities were applicable. This will then open the possibility to file returns. You can file your backdated returns, or if you're already registered and you believe that your returns are incorrect, you can correct all of those returns. But the really important one is that before the end of the amnesty, the full principal amount has been settled with ZATCA. So once you've filed your returns, it will result in a liability. Those familiar with the system would know that a Sadat bill is then generated. It's important that the liability which is on that Sadat bill is settled before the end of the amnesty, if anything, as soon as possible, in order to get the penalties waived. I will say, what we do often see is that in a first instance, when the liabilities are disclosed, first penalties are imposed, and at a later stage, those penalties are reversed. So don't be too afraid if you're making a disclosure and you're expecting all of the penalties to be waived. Usually it goes, you disclose those penalties, and subsequently those penalties get waived without you necessarily having to do anything in addition to that. Sometimes these disclosures, they may be burdensome from a financial point of view. And therefore, ZATCA has also foreseen, ever since it started the amnesty regime, and it's now been extended a number of times, in an installment plan. Installment plan needs to be specifically requested to ZATCA and has to be approved before the end of the year. You can make payments into the next year, where the amnesty should not apply anymore unless it gets extended again. And the taxpayer should adhere very strictly to the installment plan, because if he or she misses the payments, the installment plan and the associated waivers will get cancelled. And then you're back in the situation where all of the liabilities are due. Couple of steps maybe important to note in terms of the installment plan. So needs to be provided before at the end of the year, needs to be reviewed and approved by ZATCA. So if you're going to be filing requests for an installment plan on the 30th of December, it's not very likely that it will get approved. So best to agree on it now. ZATCA will inform you what the procedure and the conditions are, how to move forward. And then it's up to you as a taxpayer to comply with the installment payment plan and make sure that the payments are done as per the due date. Once we reach a position of full compliance, all of the fines are going to be cancelled. Okay. However, and it's maybe not part of steps 1 to 5, but important nonetheless to note is if there is non-compliance, then, and that non-compliance would be, I've agreed to settle my debt within the next 12 months, but I'm missing a couple of payments, then the plan cancels and the fines nonetheless get due as from the original due date. So again, there, for example, the 1%, which would be applicable as from the original filing deadline for the COT return. And importantly, I've already mentioned it, is that the payment schedules can extend until after 31st of December. And when you make those payments continuously, the penalties will still be waived, even if it's after the amnesty period, provided that the installment plan has been negotiated during the installment period. How do I apply the amnesty? Well, usually in the way it goes simply as, let's say that you have a number of VAT returns which are outstanding, like we saw with the example on the entity that is supplying electronically supplied services. You register for VAT purposes, and you register with retroactive date until the 1st of January 2022, for example. That will open all of the quarterly returns up until the current date. Then you need to file the returns as if you're filing a normal return. That will generate a Sadat bill, which you would need to settle as soon as possible. Settle as soon as possible, meaning pay all of the taxes due, or indeed agree on an installment plan. It would always be our recommendation to get in touch with your relationship manager, if one has been appointed to you, to inform them of the steps that you're going to be taking, but also to follow up to make sure that the penalties will get waived. It's good to check on the ZATCA portal to log in and to make sure that all of the penalties have indeed been waived, and if not, to open an inquiry with ZATCA. Back to you, Dana, for a couple of other considerations and factors.
Thank you, Thomas. Okay, so we have here other consideration and recommendations for the amnesty. So what's next? It's beneficial for the businesses to start reviewing the objections, the ongoing objections and appeals, whether it's on GSTC portal or on ZATCA's portal, and verify the applicability of this amnesty while the business or the company can continue with their objection. So you can avail this amnesty by paying the principal amount and continue the objection until you receive a ruling from GSTC. The second thing is review any aggressive or unsure tax positions. So it is recommended that the company review its current tax position and the past submitted tax returns if it needs to do a health check or to amend or correct any returns submitted. It will benefit from paying the principal amount, the principal difference, without paying the additional liability. Also, installment scheme versus the full payment of tax due. So maybe initiate an internal discussion with the management or the tax advisor to make an execution plan for the amnesty if needed. and to see where it's beneficial to pay the full amount or to request ZATCA for an installment scheme. The availability of business resources, cash flows, and human resources, approval from the board, and so on. Also, we have to keep in mind that this amnesty is limited. So, as we mentioned, it's going to end by 31st of December. We need to make sure that principal taxes due are paid and the returns are filed or corrected as soon as possible on ZATCA's portal. Installment plan should be submitted early because ZATCA will take its time to review and to get back to the taxpayer with the approval or any amendment on the installment plan request. Chances of rejection of the amnesty, of course, if the taxpayer is submitting any information that is presented incorrectly to ZATCA, there is a big chance that it will be not accepted under this amnesty. Thank you all for listening, and please let us know if you have any questions, and we will be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Dana. I've stopped sharing as well. You will have seen a bit of a messy desktop on my end. Apologies. Let me just look at the Q&A. The first question is, what is the period of the amnesty? Does it mean to include from 2021, since the first time the amnesty was announced? So what we see there is actually that all of the open returns prior to the current period, so all of the returns prior to 1st of July 2024 can be covered by it. So there's not necessarily a time bar specific to the amnesty. It's the general statute of limitations which applies, which essentially means that, for example, for VAT purposes, you'd have to go back 5 years if there's liabilities within those 5 years and adjust them. Umar is asking whether, for the example where KSA non-resident business, just UAE based, has been sending employees regularly to KSA and was considered as having a PE on this basis, whether this would also create a fixed establishment in our view, considering that employees are flying in on a business visa and may not be considered as permanent human resources under the definition of a fixed establishment. It's a very good question, Umar. I think there's probably a theoretical answer to it, and there's a practical answer to it. I'd say that the practical answer to it may be that very often when an entity registers a permanent establishment, there's a high chance that they have a fixed establishment. As you might know as well, there's not necessarily a time limit or a time bar for the purposes of having a fixed establishment. There is indeed the degree of permanency which is required, and very often it gets a bit in a difficult discussion. The fact of the matter is, if in essence, in practice, there is a certain degree of permanency in Saudi Arabia, then they will be considered as having a fixed establishment. So, I'd have to look a bit more at the cases of the specific situation that you're looking at. Daniel, good to see you. Thank you for asking your question. You're asking a question is, to submit financial statements for Zakat purposes, do you require full audited financials? In order for you to file your corporate income tax return and your Zakat return, you indeed need audited financials. There is a threshold, but generally businesses are above that threshold. If you have not submitted those financial statements, and if, for example, when you finalize them, they are different from the initial financial statements, then the change would be covered under the amnesty. If there is no difference, then probably the recommendation is to go and submit the audited financials as soon as possible. There's a lot of questions coming, and Donna, let me know if you want to take any of these. Provision of banking services from a non-resident to an individual customer, whether that triggers a VAT registration, and would it be considered as a permanent establishment? When it comes to banking services from a VAT point of view, it doesn't fall under a specific place of supply rule, which means that if you fall back on the general rule and you're providing a service to a non-registered customer, I think that's probably what you're referring to as individual customer, or a natural person, then that does not trigger a VAT registration. Also, the pure providing of services from abroad will not necessarily create a PE, but it may create the requirement to have to apply a 5% withholding once the payment is made, for example, by the individual customer. While I'm saying that, I appreciate that sometimes this may be more of a theoretical situation, because if you're dealing with an individual customer, that customer will not necessarily have a tax registration under which they would remit withholding taxes. But the legislation is very clear that the obligation to withhold a percentage on payments made to abroad, for example, for services, is not necessarily limited to only corporates. So it would potentially apply there as well. Well, many more questions. While doing a reconciliation between the VAT GL and what we paid lower than the reported VAT related to 1 month in 2021 and other in 2022. We amended the returns and the system calculated penalty for those periods. Are these penalties waived? I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, but from what you're describing, this indeed should be covered under the amnesty, provided that you pay the net balance before the end of the year. So indeed, we would be, you should be in a position to get a waiver for these penalties. Shweta, any exemption for preparing a balance sheet when preparing financials? I'm not an auditor, so I'm not really well placed to reply to this, I'm afraid. I can tell you that when you file your CAT return, or your Zakat return for that matter, there's elements of your balance sheet which need to be included in the CAT slash the Zakat return. Wow, there's many questions. I'll just answer 2 more, and then feel free to get in touch afterwards. Mohammed says, if our subcontractor based in the UAE refuses to register a permanent establishment in Saudi Arabia while providing installation services, should we deduct withholding tax and make payment to ZATCA under this scheme? If you're dealing with a non-registered entity and you're making payments from Saudi Arabia to abroad, and those fall under the categories which are subject to withholding taxes, and installation services is one of those categories, then indeed you should be applying withholding tax. If you've not done so far, then indeed I would say that for the period which the amnesty covers, so any taxable event before the 1st of July, then I would indeed would recommend you to do so. If the subcontractor does not want to register as a permanent establishment, I think the withholding of the taxes will probably incentivize that person surely enough to very soon either ask you for assistance in applying the withholding the double tax treaty between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, or register himself and get a register a permanent establishment in Saudi Arabia. And I'll take one more. If an invoice wasn't reported in the VAT return, which caused us to overpay to ZATCA in that VAT return, do we have to amend that incorrect return, or can we include the invoice in the following VAT returns this year? The answer is that when it comes to purchase invoices, there is, unlike the UAE, no limitation as to when to report that. So it can be in the period in which the service took place, in the period in which the invoice was received, the period in which the payment was made, or simply, if you've forgotten about it, at any point in time during the 5 years of the statute of limitations. Okay. I hope this was helpful for yourselves. This was a short but sweet overview of the amnesty. The amnesty was started during COVID, or almost at the tail end of COVID, in order to help businesses disclose their liabilities, minimize the penalties. I think ZATCA has really seen the benefit of the scheme throughout the years and has encouraged it further by extending it every time. We don't know if ZATCA will again extend it or make it part of its regular policy for penalties to be waived when there's a spontaneous disclosure which is made, i.e. the taxpayers are coming forward themselves. We are always slightly fearful that the regime will end. We've applied it multiple times for many of our clients where it has constituted substantial savings. We showed a couple of anonymous examples. Very often the amounts were far in excess of those examples. So I would recommend to anybody who was attending today or who might be watching this at home, if you're on our YouTube channel, to consider availing the amnesty. I'd like to thank Dana for co-presenting with me today. Thank you for being with us. Please do follow us on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and register for our newsletter. Those of you that have attended will get a copy of the slides as well afterwards. Thank you very much for being with us, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.